A national park, somewhere in the American Southwest. Late afternoon, the particular golden light that makes everything look like a painting and simultaneously makes it harder to see clearly into shadows and underbrush. A family has been hiking since morning. The kind of ambitious day hike that seemed like a great idea at the trailhead, and considerably less great by mile 7. Somewhere between a distraction and a moment of inattention that every parent recognizes with a kind of dread, a 4-year-old wanders off the trail. Not far, not initially. Just following something interesting the way 4-year-olds do, because 4-year-olds operate on a motivation system that has not yet incorporated the concept of consequences into its decision-making framework. A butterfly, maybe. A shiny rock. The particular way light was hitting something in the trees. The parents realize. The search begins. And it lasts in this particular story that has been reported with variations across multiple national parks and wilderness areas over the decades through the night. The child is found the next morning, safe, unharmed, sitting in a small hollow in the hillside, and according to the child's own account, not alone. There had been something there with her during the night. A dog, she said. A big dog. Warm. It had stayed next to her and she had not been cold, and she had not been afraid because the dog was there. There was no dog reported missing in the area. No dog matching the description was ever found. Wildlife rangers looking at the hollow where the child was discovered found tracks that were not from any domestic dog. Stories like this exist in a category that sits uncomfortably between documented fact and folklore, between wildlife biology and something that we don't quite have a clean framework for. They appear in indigenous oral traditions across North America, in European folklore stretching back centuries, in reported wildlife encounters that show up in park ranger logs and newspaper accounts and parental testimonies with enough consistency across time and geography to demand a serious answer to the underlying question they all pose. Why do animals, which are supposed to be afraid of humans or indifferent to them or motivated only by their own survival, sometimes approach lost children with apparent protectiveness rather than threat? The answer draws from evolutionary biology, neuroscience, behavioral ecology, the acoustic and chemical signatures that distressed children emit, and a set of cross-species social responses that are older than any individual species expressing them. And it is considerably more grounded in hard science than the mystical framing these stories typically receive. Start with what a lost child actually is from an animal sensory and behavioral perspective, because this is where the science begins and where most popular accounts of this phenomenon completely fail to go. A lost child is not simply a small human. From the perspective of any animal capable of detecting it, a lost child is a specific and distinctive package of sensory signals that differ substantially from the signals emitted by adult humans. These differences are not subtle. They are dramatic enough that multiple animal species appear to process them through different behavioral pathways than those activated by adult human presence. The vocalizations are the most immediately relevant. A crying child produces sounds in a frequency range, and with an acoustic structure that overlaps significantly with the distress calls of juvenile animals across a wide range of mammalian species. This is not a coincidence. It is a product of convergent evolution acting on a shared mammalian neural architecture for distress signaling. The infant distress call, whether it comes from a human child, a young deer, a juvenile wolf, or a distressed primate, shares certain acoustic properties, specifically a rising and falling pitch pattern, a particular temporal rhythm, and a harmonic structure that appear to be processed by mammalian auditory systems as belonging to the category juvenile in distress rather than adult. Multiple studies examining animal responses to infant vocalizations have found cross-species responses to these calls. Adult female mammals of various species show measurable physiological responses, including elevated oxytocin and cortisol, to the distress calls of infants of other species. The response is not species-locked. The mammalian brain, the neural circuitry associated with maternal behavior and infant care, appears to respond to the structural properties of the distress call itself, rather than requiring species, matching before activation. This means that an adult female deer, or wolf, or bear, encountering the sounds of a crying child, is receiving an acoustic signal that her nervous system processes through some of the same pathways activated by the distress calls of her own offspring. The behavioral output of that neural activation, which in the context of her own young would be approach and investigation and potential care behavior, does not necessarily disappear just because the source of the signal is a different species. The signal came in, the response was initiated. What happens next depends on several additional factors. The chemical dimension of this interaction is at least as important as the acoustic one, and it is entirely invisible from a human observer's perspective, which is part of why these accounts so often get filtered into the category of inexplicable rather than the category of biology, doing what biology does. A frightened or distressed child produces a chemical profile through sweat, breath, and skin secretions that is meaningfully different from the chemical profile of a calm adult human. Stress hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline, are excreted through sweat in detectable quantities. The blend of volatile organic compounds produced by a distressed child differs from that of an adult in stress, partly because children have different metabolic profiles, and partly because the physiological response to fear in a child of 4 or 5 operates through systems that are not yet fully mature, and therefore produce a somewhat different hormonal signature. Many animals that might encounter a lost child in wilderness settings have olfactory systems orders of magnitude more sensitive than human smell. A dog's olfactory system is estimated to be between 10,000 and 100,000 times more sensitive than a human's, depending on the compound being detected. Deer, bears, wolves, and most wild mammals have olfactory capabilities similarly beyond human range. These animals are not just detecting that a human is present. They are detecting a detailed chemical portrait of the state of that human, including their age, their stress level, and potentially something about their social isolation, since the chemical signature of an individual separated from their group differs in detectable ways from one that is group-embedded. The chemical signature of a child, as distinct from an adult, is also relevant to predator-prey dynamics in a way that seems counterintuitive but follows directly from the biology. Predators that routinely hunt juvenile animals of various species have evolved sensitivity to the chemical profiles associated with young, vulnerable, potentially separated animals. Juvenile animals that are lost, injured, or separated from their mothers emit chemical signals that predators have evolved to detect as indicators of vulnerability and approachability. A lost child producing the chemical signatures of youth and distress is emitting signals that activate these same detection systems. The interesting question is what happens when those detection systems are activated in animals that are not in active predatory mode, or in species that are not primarily predatory, or in animals that have sufficient previous exposure to humans that the automatic predatory response is suppressed or overridden by other behavioral programs. This is where the concept of Neoteny becomes essential to understanding why animals approach rather than threaten lost children, and neoteny is something that affects the human animal in ways that are relevant across multiple dimensions of this story. Neoteny refers to the retention of juvenile physical features into adulthood, and humans are among the most dramatically neotenous mammals on Earth. Compared to our great ape relatives, adult humans look like juveniles. Flat faces, large rounded skulls relative to body size, large eyes, small jaws, reduced body hair, and a prolonged period of developmental immaturity that extends childhood far longer than in any comparable species. These features evolved in the human lineage partly because they are associated with behavioral traits like curiosity, playfulness, and social flexibility that were adaptive in complex social environments, and partly because of the selection dynamics of cooperative breeding in which infant-like features in adults elicit caregiving from others. But the relevant consequence for the lost child story is more direct. If adult humans already retain significant juvenile features, a human child is dramatically more juvenile presenting than virtually any other large mammal's infant. The combination of large eyes relative to face size, rounded head, high-pitched vocalizations, uncoordinated movement, small stature, and chemical signals of youth and vulnerability creates a stimulus package that hits the juvenile detection systems of many mammalian species with extraordinary strength. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Many animals show what ethologists call the Kinder schema response, named by Konrad Lorenz for the set of infant features that trigger nurturing behavioral responses in adult animals. Round heads, large eyes relative to head size, small noses and mouths, pudgy limbs, and uncoordinated movement all belong to this feature set, and they trigger approach and care behavior rather than threat or flight behavior in many species under appropriate conditions. Human children are essentially walking Kinder schema stimulus packages, presenting these features with an intensity that exceeds that of most other species' juveniles. Research has demonstrated that the Kinder schema response is not strictly species-specific. Adult mammals of various species show measurable responses to the Kinder schema, features of other species' infants, with behavioral outputs including approach, gentle investigation, and in some cases, contact behavior. The domestic dog has been selectively bred partly for retention of juvenile features and juvenile-like social behaviors, which is part of why humans find dogs so appealing and so easy to bond with. But the underlying neural response to juvenile signals is present across mammalian species independent of domestication. The role of species in documented cases of animal-child protective encounters is worth examining, because the pattern of which animals appear in these accounts is not random, and reflects the underlying behavioral biology quite directly. Dogs appear most frequently, which is partly a consequence of their abundance in human-adjacent environments, and partly a consequence of thousands of years of selective breeding for human social behaviors. The domestic dog's behavioral repertoire includes responses to human distress signals that have been shaped by selection pressure over the entire period of domestication. Dogs that responded appropriately to human emotional states were more valued, more frequently bred, and more likely to pass on their behavioral genetics than dogs that didn't. The result is an animal whose social responsiveness to human signals, including distress signals from children, is effectively built into its behavioral architecture at a population level. Wild canids, including wolves and coyotes, appear in documented and folkloric accounts of animal-child encounters with notable frequency relative to their population density in wilderness areas. This may reflect the convergent social structure of wolves and humans, both highly cooperative group-living species with strong investment in juvenile care, which creates behavioral overlap in responses to distressed juveniles. The accounts from indigenous North American traditions of wolves guiding lost children or keeping them warm are extensive enough across cultures to suggest that observed real encounters, however interpreted within each culture's framework, underlie at least some of the tradition. Large ungulates, primarily deer, have been documented approaching distressed children in parks and wilderness areas in ways that park rangers have noted and sometimes recorded. The deer's approach to a crying child may reflect multiple mechanisms simultaneously: the acoustic overlap between child crying and fawn distress calls, the neotenous visual features of a child that trigger something adjacent to maternal investigation behavior, and the absence of the normal threat signals that adult human presence provides, including adult-level chemical stress signatures and confident locomotion patterns. Bears are the most counterintuitive species to appear in these accounts, given their reputation and their genuine capacity for aggression. Yet, documented cases exist, and the bear's behavioral biology offers a partial explanation. Adult female bears with cubs are among the most dangerous animals in North America because of the strength of their juvenile protection response. That same strong maternal response system, when activated by the signals of a non-threatening juvenile of another species, may in certain conditions produce approach and investigation rather than avoidance or threat. The chemical and acoustic signals of a distressed child are sufficiently close to the signals of a distressed bear cub that activation of the maternal behavior system, rather than the threat response system, is at least biologically plausible under conditions where the adult-human threat association is not being strongly activated. The adult-human threat association is a critical variable that the lost child scenario eliminates, and its elimination is central to understanding why these accounts cluster around children who are alone rather than children in the presence of adults. Most wild animals have learned through evolutionary history or individual experience or both to treat adult humans as potential threats requiring either avoidance or threat assessment responses. Adult humans emit a chemical and behavioral signature that activates vigilance and flight responses in most wild animals. Adult-level stress hormones, confident bipedal locomotion, eye contact, and the general behavioral profile of a large, capable, potentially dangerous organism. These cues suppress the approach behaviors that might otherwise be activated by other features of the human stimulus. A lost child eliminates most of these threat cues. A 4-year-old does not move with adult confidence. They do not make the kind of direct, purposeful eye contact that animals associate with predatory or threat behavior. Their stature is non-threatening. Their chemical signature lacks the testosterone and adult cortisol profile of an adult human. Their vocalizations are in the frequency range of juvenile distress rather than adult vocalization. And critically, they are alone, which removes the social amplification effect that multiple adult humans produce in wild animal threat assessment. The result is that a lost child presents a stimulus profile to wild animals that is dramatically different from the profile presented by adult humans, different enough that the automatic threat assessment responses activated by adult human presence may simply not be triggered, leaving other behavioral systems, including those responsive to juvenile distress signals, to determine the animal's response. This does not mean that wild animals encountering lost children are reliably safe to those children. The behavioral systems activated by juvenile distress signals can include predatory responses in species and individuals for whom juvenile vulnerability is primarily a hunting cue. The outcome of any particular encounter depends on the species, the individual animal, its prior experience with humans, its current behavioral state including hunger and reproductive condition, and numerous situational variables. The accounts that get recorded and transmitted are overwhelmingly the protective or neutral ones, because those are the ones that produce surviving children capable of reporting the encounter. Negative outcomes, to the extent they occur, are documented differently and less frequently reach the narrative tradition of animal-child protective encounters. The cultural elaboration of animal-child protective encounters is worth examining because it reveals how consistently and across how wide a range of cultures this phenomenon has been observed and interpreted. Virtually every major mythology has a founding story involving an infant or young child protected or raised by an animal. Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome, were suckled by a wolf after being abandoned. Mowgli, though fictional, drew on a cultural tradition of feral children reportedly raised by wolves in India that has enough documentation across British colonial records to suggest observed real encounters underlying the cultural elaboration. The mythology of virtually every indigenous culture in North America includes accounts of animal helpers approaching and assisting lost children, with wolves, bears, and deer featuring most prominently. The cross-cultural consistency of this theme is striking. Cultures with no contact with each other, separated by oceans and millennia, independently elaborated similar narrative traditions around animals approaching and protecting vulnerable children. This consistency is most parsimoniously explained not by coincidence, but by the repeated real observation of animal behavior toward children that then gets encoded in cultural narrative. Real encounters, interpreted through each culture's framework for understanding human-animal relationships, generated the narrative traditions. The traditions preserve and transmit a behavioral observation that the underlying biology fully supports even when the cultural interpretation varies. The Indian feral children accounts, documented by colonial administrators and physicians in the 19th and 20th centuries, are particularly relevant because they include multiple cases with enough contemporaneous documentation to be taken seriously as observed phenomena, whatever their ultimate explanation. The Dina Sanichar case. the Amala and Kamala case, and numerous others appear in official records with varying degrees of corroboration. The consistent element across these accounts is children found in association with wolf dens, with behavioral profiles suggesting extended time in animal company rather than brief encounters. The interpretation of these accounts remains contested, but they document at minimum a sustained human cultural observation that wolves, under certain conditions, do not treat human children the way they treat adult humans. The modern research context adds another layer to this picture through studies of oxytocin's role in cross-species social bonding, which has revealed biological mechanisms that make the observed behaviors considerably less mysterious than they might otherwise appear. Oxytocin, the neuropeptide associated with social bonding, maternal behavior, and trust, is released during positive social interactions across mammalian species. Research has demonstrated that oxytocin levels rise in both dogs and their human owners during positive interaction, a mutual hormonal response that reflects the genuinely social nature of the human-canine bond. More relevant to the present question, oxytocin release can be triggered by the physical and vocal signals of juveniles across species, as part of the mammalian maternal care system that evolved to ensure investment in offspring. When an animal's oxytocin system is activated by a distressed juvenile's signals, regardless of species, the behavioral consequence is approach and investigation and potential care, behavior rather than threat or avoidance. The oxytocin-mediated behavioral response to juvenile distress is among the most conserved across mammalian species because the underlying pressure driving its evolution, the need to ensure that distressed juveniles receive adult attention and care, has been present in some form across the entire history of mammalian evolution. A lost child, broadcasting juvenile distress signals through vocalization, chemical signature, neotenous physical appearance, and vulnerable locomotion patterns, is activating this ancient and conserved system in every mammalian animal within sensory range. What that activation produces in any encounter is shaped by competing behavioral systems, individual history, and situational context. But the activation itself, the mechanism that explains why animals approach rather than ignore or threaten a lost child under the right conditions, is biology doing exactly what it was designed to do. The question of why animals approach lost children is, at its core, a question about the deep architecture of mammalian social life and the ways in which that architecture crosses species boundaries in predictable directions under predictable conditions. The answer is not mystical, though the experience of it, a frightened child spending a cold night with a warm wild animal and emerging unharmed in the morning, produces the kind of story that easily acquires mystical framing. The answer is biological, evolutionary, neurochemical, and, in its way, more remarkable for being so than it would be if it were simply inexplicable. Mammals evolved caring for young over a period of more than 200 million years. The neural and hormonal systems that support that care are deeply conserved across the mammalian lineage. Human children, presenting the most extreme juvenile signal package of any large mammal, are effectively broadcasting on the most ancient and widely shared channel in the mammalian communication system. Sometimes, under the right conditions, something responds. Not because it knows the child is human, not because it has decided to be kind. Not because of anything that requires an explanation that goes beyond what biology already provides, but because the signal came in, and the system activated, and the behavior followed, exactly as it has followed in mammalian animals responding to the distress of the young for longer than any of the species involved has existed. The child in the hollow, kept warm through the night by something she called a big dog, was not experiencing a miracle. She was experiencing 200 million years of mammalian evolution doing what it was built to do, which is, depending on how you look at it, considerably more extraordinary than a miracle would have been.